These 5 articulation mistakes are so easy to make you might not even realize you're making them. And this causes you to blank out while speaking, reduces the clarity of your communication, and just overall makes you sound less effective when you speak up. And this makes a big difference when we try to communicate in important moments like a group discussion, presentation, or an interview. And I've made all the mistakes we're about to get into. I still make some of them to this day. And I tell you this to assure you that no matter what level you are at right now, you can start to see improvements by learning the right techniques and regularly practicing them. In fact, we spent the past 5 years training thousands of people improve their articulation, so we know it's possible. Keeping that in mind, in this video, we're going to understand how to add more structure to your communication to sound articulate, 2 simple errors to avoid to help you use more effective language, and a daily exercise to help take your articulation to the next level. By the way, if you're new here, hi, my name is Radeep from Frantically Speaking. We release communications content regularly, so if that's your thing, hit subscribe. And if you want to take your communications learning to the next level, you can click the link in the description to find out about our courses and see if we can potentially work together. Okay, so the very first mistake that we tend to make is called as burying the lead. The lead is the first sentence that we use while communicating. And it's very important that in professional settings, we always start by setting the context of what we want to talk about. And I know this sounds stupidly simple to theoretically understand, but it's baffling how often people just start talking without drawing context. And the other person is not really listening to us. They're instead trying to figure out what exactly is this conversation about.
In this case, I'm not going to go through a lot of theory. I'm in fact directly going to dive into examples of how we generally tend to speak and techniques that can help us become a lot more structured and concise, more importantly. Keep in mind, this is only for professional situations, not necessarily for personal events. Let's go. Example number 1 is this. So there's a conversation between an employee and a manager. The employee says, hey, you got a minute? So I spoke to some of the developers. Now it's bad. They've been pulling all-nighters for the past 2 weeks and this is causing them a lot of frustration. One of the developers even had to miss their child's birthday and few are on the verge of quitting. Manager, okay. Employee, yeah, so I wanted to ask if you can push the deadline by a bit. It'll help the team be less frustrated and help boost morale. The timeline the client has fixed is too tight. Manager, what project is this for? Employee, all right, this is for the Hamilton project. Now, this exchange took approximately 100 words and the time spent was about 30 plus seconds. How do we crispen and structure this out a lot more? Here's where I would like to introduce you to a technique called as framing. Framing is a technique that helps you organize your thinking. It's something I learned from one of my favorite communication teachers. We had him on our podcast as well. And it's a technique that I've been repeatedly applying again and again, and I've seen massive results in. The guy I'm talking about is Chris Fenning, and the technique I'm referring to is framing. Now, framing has 3 aspects to it: context, intent, and key message. CIK. Let's start off with context. Context is about what are you talking about. That's all. So you can either name the project or the issue, you can name the process, system, or tool you're talking about. You can give the name of the customer who you're working with or the task or objective you want to achieve. That's all it is. We start by giving context. Now, why is this important? Because many times when we are talking to somebody, we are very clear on what we need to talk about. But the other person, even though they might be working with us, they have a bunch of other things going on. And instead of laying that assumption on them, in just one simple sentence, we tell them, hey, I need to talk to you about X, Y, Z. Context is set in just one simple sentence and then we move ahead. So a few examples of this are listed on the screen over here. After we set the context, then we get into intent. Intent is about why are you communicating? Do we need their help on something? Do we need their advice on something? Are we just informing them about something? That is a thing that has to come second. A few examples over here are in this table, which have the category of intent along with the actual example as well. So the category could be needing help, advice, or input, requesting action, wanting a decision, so on and so forth. So once you have context, you then add the intent. By the way, whenever I show you these example screens, just take a screenshot of it in case you need to go through it in your own time. I'm going to take all 3 of these elements and then show you how we can apply it in the example I just showed you above as well. And finally, you have key message, which is the most important piece of your communication. Over here, you want to ask yourself, that why am I delivering this message to this particular person? So before you start writing or talking, think about all the details you can share, and then imagine your listener asking, so what? Or why? Once you do that, you will have your key message right there. And that's the thing that has to come third. So you have your context, intent, and key message. Now let's put this into action with regard to the previous example we just went through, the conversation between the employee and the manager. Now, if you look at the screen over here, what is the context? What are we talking about over here? Think about it. Over here, we're referring to the Hamilton project. That's the very first thing. That's it. That's the context we need to provide. After this comes the intent. Why are we communicating to this person? What do we want from them? What do we want from them? In this case, we want to have the deadline pushed. That's the intent. Now, you've communicated what the context is. You've told them the intent. Now imagine asking yourself, so what? Or why are you telling me this? Imagine the listener asking you that. Why are we telling them this? Because the team has a lot of frustration built up in them, and some members are on the verge of quitting because of the timeline the client has fixed being too tight. That is the key message. Now, if you put this into one simple flow, the context will be, I need to speak to you regarding the Hamilton project. Would like to request you to push the deadline by 2 days. The impossible timeline has really lowered morale, and some members are on the verge of quitting. Context, intent, and key message. If you notice from the initial example to this, on one level, the entire communication has gotten a lot more crisp. On the other hand, because of the structure we are providing to it, it's a lot easier for us to find the right word at the right time and communicate accordingly. That's where CIK, or the framing technique, becomes very, very important. Now, the amount of words the previous one took was 100. This one just takes 40. The amount of time the previous entire conversation took was more than half a minute. This one is just done in 12 seconds. And always remember that in this case, framing is just to start a particular conversation. It's not the entire conversation. So it's context, intent, key message, followed by the rest of the conversation, depending on what you're speaking about. So that's the first aspect of you speaking. And when your initial aspect is nice and organized, there's a much higher chance that the rest of your conversation and communication will come across in a much more organized fashion as well.
The next mistake that we make is using fuzz words. Fuzz words equals to vague language. When we use terms like some things, few issues, kind of, need to, and the more we can eliminate fuzz words and replace them with specific words, we're able to immediately sound more articulate. In fact, look at this sentence as an example. Here's what it sounds like with fuzz words. So in the meeting, we talked about some things related to the project. There were a few issues with the process, and we kind of need to figure out how to fix that stuff. And here's what it sounds like with clear articulation. In the meeting, we discussed delays in the project timeline. The main issue is that our approval process takes too long, so we need a more efficient way to get feedback from stakeholders. And that's about it. That's the first simple error you can start solving from a language perspective to sound more articulate. Another error that we tend to make, though, is called as the echo chamber effect. It means we tend to repeat the same word in one sentence again and again. And by just expanding our vocabulary slightly, we're able to make our sentences sound completely different. So a sentence in the echo chamber effect would sound like this. I want to improve my confidence because improving my confidence will help me in social situations, and improving it will also help me at work. Now, if you notice, the word improve is repeated constantly. Now, we don't have to replace this with fancy words. We just need to replace it with different words to make it sound more articulate. Here's what it sounds like without the echo chamber effect. I want to boost my confidence because building self-assurance will empower me in social situations and strengthen my professional presence. Now, each of those words are very understandable to almost anybody. It's just about changing the repetitive word to a synonym to make it sound better. So that's how we can add more structure and fix these two small errors to improve our language. But the problem is, when we are put on the spot, these techniques don't come to mind so easily. So what can we do to solve that? To explain this, let me tell you a quick story.
When I was learning public speaking, I remember this one speaker who I saw. His name is Oliver. And when I saw him go on stage, every time he spoke, there was just a sense of calmness that helped him communicate his points so concisely. And overall, he was just a very memorable speaker, someone you feel like listening to. And one time I got the courage to go up and ask him, hey, how do you speak like this? Can you tell me your secret? How are you so confident? And he said, Radeep, if you really looked closely at my legs while I'm speaking, you'll notice that they're shaking. That's how nervous I really am. And I asked him, I'm like, oh, then how do you manage to control your nerves so effectively? And he said this. He said, when most people go on stage, they go on stage and start speaking immediately. But if you notice, when I go on stage, you'll notice that for the first 2 to 3 seconds, I am in the center, just being silent. And I thought about him speaking, and I noticed the next few times when he did speak, when he would go on stage, he would just, for the first 2 to 3 seconds, be on top, look at everybody with 0 words. And 2 seconds seems like a short amount of time, but when you're on stage and you have so many eyes looking at you, it can seem like an eternity. But the thing that he told me is that when you manage to pause before you start speaking, you're allowing your mind to get familiar with that environment. So it has a lot more time to not just gather relevant information, but to organize it so that you're able to speak in a structured manner without blanking out. And this principle of the 2-second pause seemed to cascade everywhere. You can take it to a general conversation, in an interview. Whenever you're asked a question, instead of having the impulse to respond immediately, just pausing for about 2 seconds can give our mind enough time to gather and structure the relevant information, and hence help us speak from a much more rooted place as opposed to sounding very frantic.
So how do you end up actually practicing better articulation? One is to be a little more conscious about these techniques and provide more structure and better language. We then need to ensure we don't speak before we think by adding the 2-second pause. But how do we practice these things so that we can actually utilize them reliably?
You can simply pick up a paragraph from a book and read it out loud while opening your mouth completely on every single word and syllable. If you just read 1 or 2 pages like that, and it'll take you about 5 minutes or so, you'll notice that you're feeling a bit of pressure and soreness on your jaw area. Similar to how if you would go to the gym, you'd work out, you'd feel sore on those muscles. Developing our jaws works in a similar manner. I'm trying to improve this myself, and it takes time, but I think it's worth it. The reason that we tend to fumble and are less clear with our communication is simply because we don't open our mouths completely. The reason we speak fast is because our mouths are not opening a lot, and that's the way that we can speak fast. I cannot speak fast if I am opening my mouth completely, but if I move my lips a little, I can go as fast as I want without really stopping, and this really hurts articulation. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, try to be conscious of how much are you opening your mouth. It will allow you to improve your fluency, your articulation, as well as your overall clarity of speaking.
Now, keeping these 5 articulation mistakes in mind will help you see almost immediate improvements. But like the last technique we discussed, you need a system to practice it regularly. For that, we've created a video of few public speaking exercises that you can do at home to reliably practice and see better results. I highly recommend you check out that whole video right here.